We want to welcome you to the morning fireside chat. As was noted earlier, my name is Carlton Ely. I am the Senior Director for Federal Strategies at Race Forward, and it is a pleasure to extend greetings to you on behalf of our organization. Our president is Glenn Harris. We're the publisher of Color Lines. Our national conference is based in race. It will be in St. Louis in November. We're the home of the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, which works with local and regional jurisdictions. And we have also created the federal initiative to govern for racial equity so that we can work with civil servants and institutions that are interested in advancing and centering racial equity within their sector. The Federal Strategies team at Race Forward has been here for the past 2 days conducting training for federal civil servants. If you are here, please raise your hand for the benefit of the audience. We want to thank you for the investment of your time and your gifts and sharing and educating members of the Federal Civil Service. As was noted earlier, this plenary is entitled Centering Equity, Resetting the Dialogue on Sustainability. As you know, the Biden administration elevated racial equity as a domestic policy priority. And the current focus at the federal level is landmark. It represents an opportunity to bring serious issues into focus. And as in the environmental justice community, we say that the first rule of environmental justice is the fact that we speak for ourselves. So in honor of this core value, we thought it would be appropriate to have thought leaders to tee up a conversation about the unfinished business within the field of sustainability. Much has been written, much has been said, but since we're working under the umbrella of 2 racial equity executive orders, it seems we really need to have a conversation about a sustainability movement that truly centers equity at this time. So for today's fireside chat, there will be no formal presentations. Instead, it's designed to be more of a dialogue. And I am so excited about the thought leaders that we had the opportunity to pull together for today's plenary. First, I'd like to introduce Angela Brooks. Angela is the president of the American Planning Association, which has 40,000 members. Angela is the director of the Illinois Office of the Corporation of Supportive Housing. She currently serves on the Chicago Board of Zoning Appeals and the Illinois Affordable Housing Advisory Commission, and is co-chair of the National Housing Supply Accelerator. Angela is a native of Seattle. She's a graduate of Jackson State University, as well as the University of New Orleans, where she received a master's degree in urban and regional planning. We are also joined by Robin Morris Collin. Robin is former senior advisor to the administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and she is a retired professor of law. She co-authored the first 3-volume text on sustainability called the Encyclopedia of Sustainability, with Volume 1 being on the environment and ecology, Volume 2 being on business and economics, and Volume 3 being on equity and fairness. Throughout her long career, Robin has combined scholarship, service, activism in areas of sustainability, environmental justice, energy, and climate change. We also have Kat Ugener. Kat is an appointee within the administration of Governor Wes Moore of the state of Maryland. Kat is the Maryland Department of Housing and Community Development Assistant Secretary for Just Communities. She previously headed the Racial Wealth Equity Strategy Team at Prosperity Now. She also established and holds a registered trademark for Right to Root, which is a community-centered system for equitable development. And she received 2 awards, one from the American Planning Association and one from the City of Portland Human Rights Commission. She is currently Assistant Secretary, and she received her master's degree in Sociology, Race, Ethnicity, and Post-Colonial Studies from the London School of Economics and Political Science. And last, and certainly not least, we have Arsenio Bataka. Arsenio serves as counselor to the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. In California, Arsenio served as Assistant Secretary for Environmental Justice and Tribal Affairs at the California Environmental Protection Agency. He serves as special advisor to, he served as special advisor to California Governor Jerry Brown to help craft climate change legislation and reduce air pollution at the neighborhood level. And then finally, while working for the California Department of Justice, Arsenio advised California Attorney General Javier Becerra on environmental policy and law. So please give a firm round of applause for our discussants. So, starting off, this is just a question for the entire panel. We have 1 hour, and so what we want to do is have a dialogue about sustainability that we always wanted to have, that's reflective of the future that we want. And I would love to nerd out today and talk about Our Common Future, which was published in 1987, but we don't have time to do that. But I want to start with a different question that is really relevant to your personal narratives. And so we all are the sum of our experiences. And I'd like for each of you to take a moment to please share how you started working on issues at the confluence of sustainability and equity.
Good morning, and thank you so much, Carlton. Thank you, Race Forward. Thank you to the Center for American Progress. It's really a wonderful, wonderful luxury to have this moment to catch our breath and think together as we start this sprint towards November. The question that you asked makes me think back to my early interest in justice and fairness, which is how I came to sustainability. I went to law school thinking that we would be talking about justice, but you know, it never came up. Do I have any lawyers in the audience? You raise your hand. Okay. So, I mean, check me about this, but the word justice itself rarely came up. It was all about power and how to keep it. So I got into a posture fairly early on challenging that. And then I read a book by Bob Bullard, Dumping in Dixie. And he lays out very clearly in visual terms how power and injustice became and still are visible at the landscape level. That changed my thinking. And that was how I began this journey. Thanks.
I guess I'll chime in now. Excuse me, I don't have much voice. First, thank you, Carlton, for inviting me to this panel. As president of APA, I get invited to a lot of places, but very seldom are they talking about justice and equity. Like, actually, never. So with that said, you know, when I look back over my career, and I'm kind of the mutt of housing and planning, I've done a little bit of this and a little bit of that. I think how I really entered work around sustainability wasn't for the reasons a lot of you in this room do, because it's the right thing to do. No, that isn't how I entered that space. I worked for a housing authority, and it just operationally made more sense to make our buildings be more sustainable and environmentally friendly, long-term operating. You know, so it is the right thing to do, but that's not how I came to it, which I used to be embarrassed to say, but I think it's an important narrative, particularly for those of us in affordable housing, as to why we should be thinking about making our buildings more environmentally friendly, and some of the reasons why and why it's worth it. I think from the lens of urban planning and my leadership within APA, I mean, I'm a Black woman leading an organization that's still primarily white. So equity is a lot of the work that we do, because there's nothing that has caused more inequitable cities than land use decisions, and our profession inherently has created those situations in the two cities most of us live in. And so I come to that lens from looking at how do we not only look at how do we move forward, but how do we really undo the past harms of our profession, which has probably in my career been the most uncomfortable thing I've ever done. Because that lens hits differently for people when the person's saying it is Black. And so looking at that, thanks to a lot of the work Carlton actually has done within APA, we have our policy guides around equity, as well as our zoning for equity guides that have come out, and leading and implementing that work in our cities is one of the top priorities within APA.
usually I teach sometimes a 1 unit on environmental justice, and we start the same by showing you know, EJ issue, and I'll show you the land use issue. But it's just amazing to hear that and have you here today. I think I started to embark on looking at the confluence of sustainability. First, I didn't really use that word in my young career, but I was actually here. I was actually here maybe around 10 years ago, and I was here for this conference. And at the time, I was the Assistant Secretary for Environmental Justice at the California Environmental Protection Agency, and we had the California Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which was taking a lot of money from polluters and trying to sort of disperse the benefits out to people in California. And the primary concern of that program was to reduce greenhouse gases and make it economically feasible for the polluters to sort of continue business, which is not a good policy in the sense that's the cap and trade program in California. But what became immediately clear is as we started to figure out, okay, what are we going to do with this money, you started seeing very traditional sustainability sort of policies and programs being funded and not have any equity plan. So before battery electric vehicles, there were the Prius hybrids, and in California we used to give rebates to them, and that was part of the program. You know, you would give people rebates. Well, where I was from, nobody drove Priuses because they were still very expensive. They were very expensive, and there was no companion program for poorer folks to either. You know, we have now these other programs in place, but back then there were not any, and there was not even a desire or wanting to put a more focus on what is an equitable companion program, or how do we make this program more equitable? And because again, the focus was on purely the environment and economics. You know, these folks weren't fools. They didn't get a $5,000 to help pay for a Prius. That was a good deal. But how can we make that work for folks? So, you know, it's interesting now. You see the Biden administration under J40 use some of those things that we learned only like 10 years ago, where now you thought like, well, what should we be giving this sort of rebate to people who buy a used hybrid vehicle? Or should we be giving a rebate for those who have a car that can't pass smog or emission testing to purchase a cleaner vehicle? And so that started us down this sort of path, at least in California when I was there, of like having a serious look at all these programs that we were about to fund and figuring out how we make them more equitable and more and don't sort of exasperate the inequalities that already exist.
Thank you, Arsenio. And also thank you for making reference to the Prius example. You spoke at the NOAA Equity Forum that was held in February. Shalom Baker from DOE had made note of when she started her journey. A lot of the focus was on technology, but the conversation about people just seemed to miss. Okay.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be among such an esteemed panel. You know, I come from a very different background, so I'll start with that. Because I think my main takeaway about environmental justice is it is for everyone. If we have lived experience, I'm originally from rural Oregon. I grew up at headwaters of a river where salmon spawned. I was in old growth forests. My family were back to the land, hippies, if anybody knows about such kinds of people. And grew up in Portland, or in Oregon, and then migrated to Portland in 2002. So I had a rural experience for the first very formative part of my life, and then moved to an urban experience where we experienced segregation, redlining, living in a disinvested place that was blighted, being blamed for such things, and the community really being heavily impacted by displacement and gentrification. A massive infusion of resources came in. And then that is when I started to learn that we make place, but we don't think about the people in place. And we use coded terms like community, which is still talking about place or neighborhoods. We base funding decisions on that, and we just assume, kind of this field of dreams, we build it and they will come, we build it, they will stay. I started learning about social sustainability. So as Carlton said, my background, I'm a sociologist, so I care about the people first. And looking at the investment is so important until I started learning about externalities and how we protect or conserve the environment, how we force people off of that land who have had subsistence and a wonderful life heretofore, and then we subject them to the economy where we know there's discrimination, differential access to wages, work, wealth, and really thinking about how do we square this circle. I'm a first-generation non-traditional college student, so I just came to university with a lot of questions, a lot of why. And that was in 2004. And around that time, the World Trade Organization was created. I learned about the IMF, the World Bank. Like, I was a voracious learner, really trying to understand what are these drivers and determinants of people's health, the personal becoming political, looking at data and being able to see across states, across the country, even though people are not in the same community of persons, their outcomes are the same. I said, this is fascinating. So I started doing, human-centered systems change is what I call it, people-centered placemaking, which is what has, called me in. I would say I feel very fortunate that my passion has become my profession, and we'll obviously talk more about that. But I'm very grateful to be here. I just think there's something about people and profit and planet that is vital in these days and times, and I hope that we broaden who we believe can actually be thought leader, and that we value lived experience, not just in engagement and outreach, but sharing power or ceding power to the people who have done it right for so long.
All right, real talk. Covering themes that I normally don't hear in my sustainability panels. Certainly not at But we did have the opportunity to attend the United Nations Sustainability Summit in Brazil in 2012, so we got to get it out now. so thank you for everything that you shared. But we want to drill deeper since we're already on the theme of real talk. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. We really do need to go there. You guys have already noted that there is a social pillar of sustainability, and we know that over the span of the past 30, 40 years, sometimes the way in which that pillar has been handled has left a lot of people's lives. And it seems how we handle that pillar is rooted in a deeper challenge that reflects a tendency to suppress conversations about race as well as racism. And this is important because we're seeing currently in our nation a chilling effect, especially, for example, from last year from the Supreme Court decision that was made. And now also we're seeing a backlash on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives overall. So let's start with your thoughts or concerns about the present backlash, as well as what you consider to be a teachable moment. And I want each of you to give some consideration to what your teachable moment is for us right now. Because you wouldn't be here on this panel if you didn't know how to overcome adversity or if you didn't know how to navigate turbulence. So just want to get your thoughts, but also to get your teachable moment. Rob, would you like?
Okay.
You wrote the encyclopedia.
I will go first, knowing that the people in this panel can really do this tough question justice. Let me make a couple of observations. Number one, the moment we are in does not call for anticipatory conservatism. I see too many people who are worried about November, who have then decided that they're going to do the work of our most extreme right-wingers for them. I'm not going to help them. That is to say, this is a moment to be bold. This is a moment for us to step out on what we know to be true. Okay, that's one observation. By the way, 6 weeks ago, I could not have said that. So I am really delighted to be outside of the federal government and not under the Hatch Act at the moment. My second observation is this: race is not real. Race is a construct, and a very, very powerful construct, and it does one thing very well, and that is to make sure that somebody is subordinated. So I look at my sociologist. I mean, race was and is an extraordinarily powerful tool. But let us understand what the tool is and not confuse it with a delusion that somehow we are not the same. We are human beings. We all need clean air, clean water, and tillable land to work with. So with those two observations in mind, what I would suggest is that we need to think about the outcomes that race and racism have had for our local communities and our country. You can see them. You can see them in the water. You can see them in the air. They are not secrets. And we did a lot of this in overburdened communities because of racism. That's the redlining piece, and that's been remarkably well documented. If you haven't read Richard Rothstein, The Color of Law, please do read that. Having said that, then I think we can and should look at the outcomes for human health and the outcomes for the environment. That's my sense of passion, obviously coming from EPA, where our mission is about human health and the environment. We can look at outcomes and commit ourselves to strategies that intentionally and deliberately center better outcomes. So let me leave it there.
I can't speak like Roger because I do still work with federal government, but I would say this, is that seen this, we've all seen this before. I saw it in California with Proposition 187 and Proposition 209. And so from the beginning, I think, as we were looking to address, I used to have a presentation I used to give when I was in state government, and it had the R word in quotes. It says, now we're talking about the R word, because at that time, it was still very much not wanting to talk explicitly about race. And we, when I would give that presentation, it was under this sort of these laws that in California that you could not make contractual, you can't make basic decisions based on race. And what we did and how we sort of dealt with that was to focus on, we pivoted in our policy work at least to focus on geographic-based policy. So all of you know, because all of you are presumably have some environmental justice background. I think we have experts here on the panel that know more about this as well, but we knew when I showed that slide about the R word and I showed the most polluted areas in California, and then I gave the racial breakdown, we knew what we were talking about. We all know that exists. And so how do we construct policy around that? And I would argue that's what you see in J40, that's what you saw in California, is that we went very quickly to a place-based strategy that did two things. One, still allowed us to prioritize and focus in the areas that we knew needed help, that also happened to be primarily where people of color live. And two, it allowed us also to deprioritize or look at sort of protecting those communities from the harmful, sort of the harms that may be imposed on them. So it's the classic benefit and burden sort of model, right? You increase the benefits and you try to decrease the burdens. And, you know, and I'm not saying that that approach is perfect, nor am I saying you should walk away from race, absolutely not. But I do think I hope people, many of you are from the federal government here, maybe I think, I don't want you to leave this conversation like some, even in my own building, that hear about this decision and think like, oh, well, we can't do anything, or there's this chill effect. I know it exists in the federal government because I hear it. And then, oh, well, we cannot do this now, we can't do this now. So I would just say that there are tools and there are ways to continue the work to pursue racial equality. There's paths to still pursue strong equity provisions. And in fact, we do it every day in HHS, you know, with addressing health disparities. I mean, I have a few press releases I'll get into later today, but we'll show you that, you know, we still address, you know, disparities when it comes to health disparities, when it comes to race in our policies. Nothing's going to stop us from doing that. Not this decision, you know, and not, sure as hell not, you know, campaigns to do that, because we, you know, the DEI sort of campaign is the same campaign of, you know, critical race theory. You know, these attacks we've seen this game before. And so, and we'll get through them. But you do, if you're in government, you do have to think through different approaches and different ways to sort of sit through this, because you have, as Robin was saying, you have some limitations that maybe others on the outside do not.
Man, I should have gone first. Follow this. And, you know, I think as someone who spent the majority of my career in government, my teachable moment, similar to kind of what Robin and Arsenio alluded to, is now that I'm outside of it, I have a lot more freedom to address things. I work for the Corporation for Supportive Housing, so we do things, all things homelessness, really, and permanent supportive housing. But, you know, if you want to talk about equity, I mean, I live in Chicago where 75% of the homeless population is Black and maybe 20% of the city. And so I deal with equity every single day, and you add in the healthcare aspect of it, it gets even worse. And so I work in communities that are most burdened by bad policy decisions. And so I think a lot of the kind of how I've changed my work has really come from looking at equity. And that's not something you're taught in planning school for sure, despite the fact that our profession has been inequitable since it started. And looking at, you know, I sit on the Chicago Zoning Board of Appeals, and I mean, if ever you want to talk about equity, we'll talk over drinks about that. But, you know, undoing that, and typically, particularly in the roles of like planning commissioners, zoning commissioners, all that, they're very rarely diverse boards, like it's almost never. And so you're looking at how do you influence that, and obviously that is with policy. And so from the outside, looking at how do I work with those of you who are in government, who have less ability to do so and address things, and how can you be a disruptor in a positive way? And I think that's really important. Conferences like this and research like you've done, I think is really important, because it gives people the tools to address things and find a way to really move the needle. I think as we see more and more attacks around equity, and really, as you mentioned earlier, a power shift, because that's what equity really is. And I wrote down your quote, by the way. You know, I think we're going to see more of it, but as leaders, we have to be willing to take a stand and make a fight to really move the needle for our communities that have been underserved since the founding of this country, to ensure that everybody has a safe place to live, but also thrive. Because I live on the south side of Chicago, and what I can say is, during the pandemic, I heard elected leader after elected leader, as parks were closed, like, oh, walk around your neighborhood. I was like, well, you can't walk around my neighborhood without your security detail. You won't. Like, you're just not gonna. And that's, you know, I have a privilege of, I choose to live there, but my neighbors don't. And so working toward making sure that everybody can do the same thing as on the north side of Chicago is, you know, the fundamental thing that I'm working toward in my professional work, and we've got a long way to go. So.
Thank you, Andrew. And I appreciate you amplifying that as a planner, even in the College of Fellows with AICP, they're retooling. They're constantly in the process of retooling, which is center. And also I want to say I appreciate the progress that's being made. There's still more work to do, clearly. But what I like the most, at least in terms of what is happening, is that when you have a professional association or a sector like the American Planning Association to start to more visibly address these issues, at least it helps to send a message. Because obviously, at the federal level, administrations change, but as long as you have these outside interests, these professional groups, these sectors, these trade associations, integrating, centering, leading with, it will help to generate the right side of outside productive energy, inside-outside strategy. So glad to hear that. We want to make sure we have questions from the audience as well. So I am alerting you to the fact that it is 11:11. So please take a moment to walk up to one of the microphones because we do want to engage you as well. I'm going to ask another question, but take time to formulate your question and we can open it up a little bit further. Kat, I want to follow you in terms of your experiences based in Portland while we're having this conversation about sustainability, because Portland as a city normally brands itself as being a sustainability leader. But in your experience, you saw a disconnect in terms of the record. The city saying one thing with green, we have a wonderful urban growth boundary, everything's walkable, bikeable, but you saw a real disconnect in terms of externalities that you were pointing in terms of how there were social impacts of people. So what I want to ask you is, how are the lessons from your experience in Portland being transferred, or how you've already started to make some of those lessons, because you have firsthand experience working on what it means to encourage and just communities from your experience in Portland. How's that being transferred as you start to think about your work?
Thank you for that. Well, spoiler alert, there's nothing called just development. I've been looking, so I'm very excited to think about what kind of contribution can be made. Why I focus on human-centered design, why I bring design to this work is the first rule is empathy. And so if we don't center people with lived experience, how do we care about people, right? And I worked with this amazing community elder who since passed on. She was my champion and my sponsor very much in Portland. Her name is Sherelle. And when I talked to her about equity, because she was an elder, she just looked at me and she said, "The last shall be the first." And that is exactly what my work does. It's very much thinking about, why are people not here? Who's not here? Why are we still not bringing people in, or why are we bringing people in ways that are traumatizing? Asking people to share too much of their story, asking them how I know that you're impacted, but how impacted, right? Being able to think really about what can we learn from evidence, from data, from research, what kinds of analyses can we do so that we don't overtax people to tell us why they're hurting. I think that is the most important. Our community was told in Portland, as we lost an entire 10-block radius. Now people are moved 20 miles out to the edge of the urban growth boundary where people never lived, that they didn't understand the value of their community, and that's why they lost. We didn't talk about speculation, predation. We did not talk about the rezoning from residential to commercial. We did not talk about the fact that that there was a Superfund site right in the middle, the Willamette River. I wrote about it when I was at the LSE. Is one of the most polluted rivers in the nation because of shipbuilding, a history of shipbuilding that brought Black people to Portland. So, being able to think about that, the root causes, thinking about the consequences, that's how I think about the data, and thinking about the cure. Every community needs a different solution. I think that's one of the challenges of policy. It often tries to do one size fits all, but there are some universal best practices. Guaranteed income, baby bonds. I sit and think about all of the dollars that were released during the pandemic, even the PPP. It was meant to target, it didn't even trickle. How do we think about actually targeting the allocation, the disproportionate allocation of these dollars to the people who need it most? So you know, sometimes I think, well, it's a blessing that I'm in my role. I also think, well, thank goodness there's the internet and people can Google me, because some people ask, how do you get in the roles that you're in? And I think I just have to really take the honor of being someone with lived experience who might be in a seat that my whole community would never get into. I had a supervisor who said, use your privilege and positional power in ways that will make you proud, and also use it as though you will lose it, because you just may. And I think that is a big takeaway for us. And, you know, I just have to be a straight shooter. I think that we don't have time to coat and code. And I think that we have enough people with like hearts and like minds in these days and times. We can find coalitions of the willing, and we can really, you know, go further together. And I think we can do it quickly in these days and times.
Things about this moment. When I say this moment, I mean in terms of the president and the administration taking a clear stance on racial equity being a policy issue, is the fact that they recently reported, you know, some of the latest statistics about the economy or about labor at this point. And the point is the fact that critics have always said that if you focus on equity, then it's going to just jam up the economy. Is there evidence that actually would suggest that is not the case?
That is the most stupid observation that I can think of coming in from a democratic nation. So let me start with a few facts and evidence of my own. Number one, did you know that for kids who are 15 and younger, they already live in a nation that is majority minority? They already do. That's their world. We are quickly moving to a multiracial nation in which most people, by far the greatest majority, when we think about the majority of children, women, and men, that by far the majority are going to identify themselves as either multiracial or they understand what it is like to live in a multiracial society. Now, what does that have to do with the question that you asked me? Here it is. How can our economy thrive if we do not include them? How can our future improve if we do not include them? The majority of us. That's what a democracy is about. And by the way, we were committed as a society to economic democracy as well. That is what the antitrust laws were there for. We had a commitment to democracy that needs to be recommitted, needs to be elevated and lifted up for the benefit of most of the people in our society. So I would also just suggest that we can't actually have a democracy or a progressive nation. We can't actually solve things if the three people involved are Gates, Facebook man, and Bezos. We can't. And what bothers me is those are the three people who got together in San Francisco to talk about artificial intelligence. Those three people. And we know how important artificial intelligence is for our future. Those three guys got together and decided what was going to be the convention for artificial intelligence. This is an example of why equity matters, why inclusion matters, and why we cannot have a decent society if we do not include all of the people in it. Thanks.
I would just like to add, having studied social contract theory, which was a lot of why I went to school, is really asking, what did we commit to? And especially if for some there was never an actual inclusion. It's really trying to think about how do we create good health outcomes. I think that's the other thing that we often don't think about, and why public policy was put into place in the early part of the 1900s. You know, do we want people to live, as Hobbes would say, nasty, brutish, and short lives? What we know about wealth gap and wage gaps, there's an amazing professor at Harvard who is now talking about life expectancy gaps, that we can actually predict about $850,000 differential, a limited amount of life, the quality of life, but also quantity of life. So there is a moral imperative, I think, but there is also an economic imperative. Also, so much of the innovation we seek to solve climate challenges, you know, being able to connect more globally with different kinds of people, require people with different ways of thinking. I was just reading the other day, why did we follow diversity or start to implement that? And it's to better the majority white workforce that existed. It said they needed more exposure to people who are different than them, especially when we start working outside of the United States. And you know, we call people minorities in this country, but we're a majority minority, or majority minority internationally. So in order to remain viable in a globalized world, the other part is it's very short-sighted for us to think the way that we have and to try to solve some of these bigger challenges. We can't be everywhere at once, to Robin's point. 3 people cannot dictate for 7 billion people. How do we actually include people and allow them to own their intellectual property, to patent, to trademark? Those are some of the ways that wealth has been built over time as well, in ways that are non-extractive and destructive to the environment. So I think there's just a need for us to rethink society at this point. Think again about a social contract, but really think about it as something that can drive sustainability over time. Sustainability doesn't mean better. It means enduring as well. And that's one of the challenges I've always had with, can we just resilience our way out of a structure, or do we actually need to rethink the structure and redesign the structure?
Ask Arsenio a question, and then I'm going to ask Angela a question. Arsenio, you work for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and many of the agencies, as you were alluding to, within your department are actively engaged in advancing initiatives around health equity, Center for Disease Control, PERSA, etc. You've been a trailblazer in terms of your work. So is it fair to say, at least in the context of your department, that the government is actually challenging a narrative that was rooted in a false choice?
Yeah, I would say that beyond challenging, they're demonstrating that it was a false choice. When we came in as part of this administration, you don't look any further than like COVID. And my boss, the secretary, he often talks about the clearest example of how strong equity policies are good for America, it's good for everyone. And you know, we don't need to look back too far in COVID, where you saw the vaccination rates among white people versus black and brown people. And there was a big gap. It was 30% or something like that. I don't have the figures in front of me. And then the secretary walked through all the various policies and programs that we put in place to sort of close that gap, and we did. We brought the vaccination rates up to where white, black, and brown people had almost the same percentage. And so, I think that's a good example that, our department has, as you said, have been doing it for a while and will continue to do that. And I think time and time again, we prove that our health equity policies make sense. I was sharing, I alluded to earlier, to answer this question, I was just going to look back at the last, 7 press releases that we just put out. And first thing I came across was HRSA. These are the folks who, HHS, it's a department that funds basically federal qualified health centers. And HRSA just put out, a little bit over $50 million to help qualified health centers provide care to individuals who are incarcerated now 90 days before their release, because we know that over half the people that are incarcerated have substance use disorders, and then I think like 80% of the folks that are locked up have, multiple, not just substance use disorders, but other mental health issues. And so we know that that's a population that is going to hit the streets soon, and can, benefit from getting connected directly to those resources, those important health resources soon. And we hope, and I think the literature supports, the evidence supports that in pilot programs where this has happened, that you have seen a strong decrease in recidivism. So you're checking a lot of boxes there for good and for good, and it helps us promote health equity, because the people that are behind bars are largely minority population. So the other one that I was going to mention, since we have housing folks here, is and these are all just this last week. We proposed a new rule on we pay providers for Medicare payments, right? And we just issued this new rule that looked at the unhoused population, homeless population, and said we're going to pay doctors or providers more money to spend more time with their patients to help do the thing. If you're a legal aid lawyer or you're a doctor or you serve in some direct way with the public, you know the drill. People come for you for one problem. It could be housing, it could be they get evicted, it could be they lost their job, but then you quickly realize they need a pathway to something else. They can't, they're behind on their bill, their electric bill, they need help there. And so this rule, and it's highlighted prominently as one of the sort of main things in this patient payment rule is the fact that we're shifting and we're sort of prioritizing these social determinants, of course, that we've been talking about for a long time, but the policies have trailed a bit. And so now we're really trying to put those into action. There are a lot of press releases, and if you look closely at them, you will see equity in the majority of them. So this is what I would say to the EJ folks, and what I said to people in California maybe 10 years ago, this last time I was here, is that soon the power shift is happening, whether it's for all the reasons that a lot of people said, that shift is going to happen. And soon there will not be a question of whether or not it's environmental justice policy or housing policy, whether or not you have an equity provision in there. That day's coming. It's coming. But we have to, of course, I experienced one point in California where you saw it like tilt. And you knew, I was like, oh yeah, like the enviros, I go, oh yeah, you guys aren't going to get a bill in this state without some justice provision in this. You can go take a hike, and it forced them to consider the justice or the equity in their environmental proposals. I think the same will happen soon, of course, in health and other in the environment. But as we transition, and of course the rest of the nation is going to be a little bit slower, but as we transition, it's going to be important to utilize some of the tools that we talked about earlier to sort of show people the evidence that it is good and it's good for all of us, and you can't ignore it. That's it.
Thank you, Arsenio. Angela, I want to focus on you a bit. First, I want to say congratulations on completing your second year as president of the American Planning Association. You just finished your national planning conference. Came here to Washington, D.C. to spend time with us. We know your schedule is pretty demanding. And also, just want to acknowledge that you're actually the first president of the American Planning Association to participate in the National Environmental Justice Conference. That's very important for many of the reasons. For the benefit of our audience, could you share just some of the housekeeping that APA has been doing in recent years? And we know it's not all perfect, but to help people understand what has been happening in terms of the tipping point, as Arsenio had noted, in terms of efforts to center equity or to set the dialogue for how racial equity actually affects every asset.
Yes, well, first, thank you. leave it at that. Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I think part of my being here is a reflection of the work that AP is doing, really to center equity in all that we do. And that is an afterthought, because as we all know, often it's like the checkbox after a plan is done. Oh, let's add an equity and let's not include people with lived experience, as Kat so importantly structured and pointed out. And so we're really threading it through our whole organization. So a couple of examples is we're streamlining our certification process. Unlike engineers and lawyers, you don't have to be licensed, but there is a licensing or certification process. And so we're looking at how do we remove barriers for people of color to go through the certification process. And also the qualifications to become certified, particularly we know the cost of education. Graduate degrees are becoming more unobtainable for many, and for a very long time in planning you needed to have a graduate degree, or if you didn't, there was this long process. So looking at how do we eliminate that. We've made a huge concerted effort to elevate diverse voices at our national planning conference, which Carlton and I have been around since the 90s, and I mean, we could probably count back then how many diverse voices were heard. It was usually the planning of the Black Community Division, the 2 sessions they could do. So like this year last year we had a Black woman and a woman who was other abled, which was a first. She was in a wheelchair, so that was very visible, like a little bit of diversity. And this year we had 2 Black speakers. So, you know, we haven't seen that on the main stage, and certainly more sessions that are reflecting that. And then the more exciting thing for me is we've published several policy guides from housing to equity, so really looking at equity in housing. I don't think this room needs to hear the full background on that. And our zoning policy guide and our equity and zoning policy guide. And you know, the thing I love most about those is those were written for not only planning practitioners, but community activists. The Equity for Zoning Guide gives real strategies on how community members can fight for equity, specifically around zoning, which that's a whole nother conversation. And storytelling, like showing examples of planners in the communities of the equity work, what's working and what hasn't worked, or what should have been done differently, because I think we have to start being, with technology, there's no reason we're not learning from each other. So making sure we're doing that. We just celebrated the 20th anniversary of our first diversity summit, which was here in DC in 2004, and being able to look at 20 years ago where we were, we hadn't had, I think we probably were having our first minority member on our board to, well, we don't have that many now, but at some period in the last couple of years, we've had up to 4 people of color on our board, reflecting both Black, Hispanic, and Asian. We need to do some work around Indigenous, but we're getting there. We just had our first Indigenous fellow inducted in 2 years ago, so we're moving the needle a little slower than I would prefer, but we are moving it. And then, you know, one of the things we're really doing is looking at our governance structure and how it really does limit diverse voices to get into the national board level. But that doesn't mean we don't get the microaggressions, me particularly. So like I remember hearing something when we're in the middle of a governance battle now, and a past leader said, well, I don't see how that's a problem, because our last 3 presidents have been diverse. And so I said, have you looked at our board pictures lately? I'm Black. That's it. We have a Hispanic woman. If, you know, like, so you let the top person be diverse and like it's all good. You know, like that's not reflecting our membership, nor is it reflecting the country that we're representing. And so I think while we're moving the needle, the priorities are there, they're still getting people to come with us is the next focus, and not being exhausted doing it. Because, you know, I'm kind of tired of bringing you along the way. Go read a book. I don't know what to tell you, but you know. So that's kind of the things we're doing, and certainly as I'm winding down, just making sure that setting up the infrastructure to support those coming behind me and pinpointing those and helping them find the pathway to leadership is the biggest priority on my plate. And then ensuring that the equity focus doesn't go anywhere, because many of our planners are working in states like Florida, like Texas, where there's a huge battle, and including the academy. a lot of our schools are having a hard time. You can't teach the history of zoning, not say zoning started as a tool of segregation and racism, but you can't say that in some states, but that's an important part of the lesson. And so working around how do we support them and the professors who are going to be struggling, because we didn't get that kind of education in planning school. They started doing it, and now we're reversing it. And so it has to be a priority, and it has to be something that we're fighting, and it has to be something that we're providing resources to supplement, and that's the work we're doing.
Thank you. And also, I want to say I appreciate the progress that's being made. There's still more work to do, clearly. But what I like the most, at least in terms of what is happening, is that when you have a professional association or a sector like the American Planning Association to start to more visibly address these issues, at least it helps to send a message. Because obviously, at the federal level, administrations change, but as long as you have these outside interests, these professional groups, these sectors, these trade associations, integrating, centering, leading with, it will help to generate the right side of outside productive energy, inside-outside strategy. So glad to hear that. We want to make sure we have questions from the audience as well. So I am alerting you to the fact that it's 11:11. So please take a moment to walk up to one of the microphones, because we do want to engage you as well. I'm going to ask another question, but take time to formulate your question, and we can open it up a little bit further. Kat, I want to follow you in terms of your experiences based in Portland while we're having this conversation about sustainability, because Portland as a city normally brands itself as being a sustainability leader. But in your experience, you saw a disconnect in terms of the record. City saying one thing with green, we have a wonderful urban growth boundary, everything's walkable, bikeable, but you saw a real disconnect in terms of externalities that you were pointing, in terms of how there were social impacts of people. So what I want to ask you is, how are the lessons from your experience in Portland being transferred, or how you already started to make some of those lessons, because you have firsthand experience working on what it means to encourage and just communities from your experience in Portland. How's that being transferred as you start to think about your approach?
Thank you for that. Well, spoiler alert, there's nothing called just development. I've been looking, so I'm very excited to think about what kind of contribution can be made. Why I focus on human-centered design, why I bring design to this work, is the first rule is empathy. And so if we don't center people with lived experience, how do we care about people, right? And I worked with this amazing community elder who since passed on. She was my champion and my sponsor very much in Portland. Her name is Sherelle. And when I talked to her about equity, because she was an elder, she just looked at me and she said, "The last shall be the first." And that is exactly what my work does. It's very much thinking about, why are people not here? Who's not here? Why are we still not bringing people in, or why are we bringing people in ways that are traumatizing? Asking people to share too much of their story, asking them how I know that you're impacted, but how impacted, right? Being able to think really about, what can we learn from evidence, from data, from research, what kinds of analyses can we do so that we don't overtax people to tell us why they're hurting. I think that is the most important. Our community was told in Portland, as we lost an entire 10-block radius. Now people are moved 20 miles out to the edge of the urban growth boundary where people never lived, that they didn't understand the value of their community, and that's why they lost. We didn't talk about speculation, predation. We did not talk about the rezoning from residential to commercial. We did not talk about the fact that that there was a Superfund site right in the middle, the Willamette River. I wrote about it when I was at the LSE. It's one of the most polluted rivers in the nation because of shipbuilding, a history of shipbuilding that brought Black people to Portland. So, being able to think about that, the root causes, thinking about the consequences, that's why I think about the data, and thinking about the cure. Every community needs a different solution. I think that's one of the challenges of policy. It often tries to do one size fits all, but there are some universal best practices. Guaranteed income, baby bonds. You know, I sit and think about all of the dollars that were released during the pandemic, even the PPP. It was meant to target, it didn't even trickle. How do we think about actually targeting the allocation, the disproportionate allocation of these dollars to the people who need it most? So, you know, sometimes I think, well, it's a blessing that I'm in my role. I also think, well, thank goodness there's the internet and people can Google me, because some people ask, how do you get in the roles that you're in? And I think, I just have to really take the honor of being someone with lived experience who might be in a seat that my whole community would never get into. I had a supervisor who said, use your privilege and positional power in ways that will make you proud, and also use it as though you will lose it, because you just may. And I think that is a big takeaway for us. And, you know, I just have to be a straight shooter. I think that we don't have time to coat and code. And I think that we have enough people with like hearts and like minds in these days and times. We can find coalitions of the willing, and we can really, you know, go further together. And I think we can do it quickly in these days and times.
Good morning. It's not necessarily a question. I think I'm going to be stirring up the pot and may have to change my identity and move to another country. But anyway, I'm Joanna Malstansel. I'm Senior Advisor for State and Private Forestry and Tribal Forestry in the U.S. Forest Service. And this, I'm speaking from an indigenous viewpoint. I've come to this conference for many years because environmental justice, equity, and inclusion is a very passion of mine. But I never, people don't seem to reflect on that this is indigenous homelands. Diversity means something different to us than it does other people. Diversity was the downfall of our country for us. This is our homelands. So I would like to see more indigenous organizations, leaders, and tribal leaders involved in this dialogue, because when you talk about equity, we still don't have it. We didn't get citizenship in our own country until the late 1920s. We still fight for it every day of our lives. And we hear about diversity, we hear about equity and inclusion. We have the highest infant mortality, the highest rates of diabetes, the shortest lifespan of any people in this country, highest poverty levels. And we look around us and we see what's happening to Mother Earth, and we ask ourselves, I can only speak for myself and the indigenous people that have talked to me, but we wonder, why did they fight so hard for a land and then they spit on Mother Earth? They drain her of her life essence. And we have so much to offer in our traditional knowledge, our science, and it is science. It's just not, it's not folkways, it's science of how to deal with that. But we don't have a place at this table. Where are the indigenous people? I mean, there's a few here. Where are they there talking to us about what diversity means to us? It was hurtful. So anyway, I just wanted to say, when we talk about, let's don't forget about the other people. And I'm certainly, the indigenous people of this land aren't the only indigenous people out there that have experienced what we've experienced. So let's make room for us too. Thank you. Great meeting.
I do want to take a second to acknowledge what you said, and Carlton and I have been having this conversation, so one of my responsibilities as APA president is traveling internationally to my counterparts, and I'm just coming back from New Zealand, and one of the things I noticed, Carlton, who lived there, is how much further along they are in New Zealand around reconciliation, around exactly what you're talking about. And it was very eye-opening for me as a planner about how much work we really do need to do to incorporate the expertise of those who are indigenous to the land that we have taken and how we develop that. And I wanted to honor what you said and acknowledge that for me as a planner and as the leader of a planning organization, it's a huge focus. We have just recently reenacted our, I can't remember the official name, but it's Tribal Indigenous something division, which had had disbanded many years ago. So we just brought them back and really uplifting that voice. and including them in the table. And I do think you're right. It's absolutely necessary, but particularly when we talk about developing and how we're developing, the original occupants of this land know how to do that, and they are the experts. And as we start looking at the loss of, you guys know how to find it. So I do think that's important, and I do think we should honor that. And I know, for me, my commitment to that definitely got increased going to both Australia and New Zealand. You know, in New Zealand, the original name is the first name on the sign, not the colonized name. And it was just very visible to see and react to. And it made me kind of ashamed at the lack of work that we've done around reconciliation in this country in a real honorable way. Like, the conference started with Maori culture welcome. Like, the conference couldn't start until we did that. There's not just a land acknowledgement. Every speaker acknowledged not only the land acknowledgement, but the leaders of those communities. And it was just really eye-opening for me.
Thank you, Angela, for reporting on your recent trip to the New Zealand Planning Trust. Given the fact this conversation is on sustainability, there is a saying that the Maori offer in Aotearoa, New Zealand, this mo tatoa, mo ka huria, mo ke hakinai. It means for us and our children afterwards. So I wanted to make sure I offered that given the fact we're having this conversation about sustainability today. Kat, and then we'll take another question.
I just wanted to thank you for naming what might not have been named, and also to offer, I sit as a chair of a board of an organization called EcoTrust in Oregon that does work with triple bottom line and has been doing it for 35 years. We draw down a significant amount of new market tax credits. Over 33% of those go to our indigenous communities around the bioregion. So that's in Alaska, Hawaii, California, Washington, and Oregon. It might be an organization you want to learn more about. We've also just brought in our first external executive director. It was founder-led, and her name is Rhonda Rutledge, and she is from the Cherokee Nation. So we're very honored to have a leader from communities who is actually now stewarding a very successful and prominent, predominantly white institution in these days and times. So that might be a resource to also connect to.
Thank you all for being on this panel today. Piggybacking off what this woman said in regards to indigenous attention, I'm an IT specialist at the EPA, and as you all speak about data and how we're lacking the data around the things that we all do as far as sustainability and social equity goes, per what Robin said about in the future more people are going to be identified as multicultural. So with us not having the data that we need, as in like the MD 715 that focus on where we're lacking amongst our positions, skilled positions and our grade positions within the federal government, let alone things that may go on in the private industry, how do we maintain that level of focus if more people identify as multicultural later on down the line to establish that level of sustainability amongst these efforts from federal dollars and private dollars to maintain people being seen, resource allocated amongst our communities so that those things are facilitated for people to have the better lives that they should have had to begin with.
Well, I will offer one point, just to tee things up. Definition is important, and I'm saying in the context of equity, and I'm a purist on this issue because equity is a targeted approach. Regardless of how demographics shift, there's always going to be a need, and we need to target addressing the need that may be explicit. So when I look at equity, there are three questions I always ask. Are there deficits? Who's bearing the burden of the deficits? And how do we make sure well-intentioned interventions don't make deficits worse? There are always going to be people, regardless of how demographics may mix, they're going to have a need that's going to need to be addressed. The environmental justice movement has always focused on race and income. You can be white and poor and living in West Virginia. You will get the support of the US EPA, it's the environmental justice community. So again, are there deficits? Who's bearing the burden of the deficits? And how do we make sure that we don't make those deficits worse based on our interventions.
Good morning, it's John Ballinch. I work with Groundwork USA, which is the national support organization for 21 place-based environmental justice affiliates that are predominantly working in redline communities that have experienced the disinvestment that's been such a large focus in this discussion. Carlton, I want to thank you first for assembling this incredible panel. What a thought-provoking, engaging, and critical conversation. Thank you all for your insight. I'm thinking a lot about movements, right? We're having this conversation around equity and sustainability and justice because movements aren't, created through the federal government. Movements are not created through nonprofits, right? But indeed, they are housed and sustained, right, in these really critical institutions that you have all served on or are a part of. And so we know that movements are from people. Right, movements are from people. And so I guess just kind of based on, Kat, you were talking about empathy as a core value that drives you. I'd love to hear from you on how you all think, where you sit, how these large institutions, planning institutions, the federal government, can really ensure that you are tapping into that movement so that sustainability and equity isn't a buzzword, but it is a value, it is a practice. And that you're always deeply connected to the folks who are driving that change from below out of necessity. Thank you.
I'll just quickly say, when the World Trade Organization was constituted, it was reported in the news, the second superpower of the world was the people, right? And the voice of the people started being heard differently in 2000. I just always was inspired by that. People often tell me I'm a community organizer and activist. I'm really not. But I think inside-outside strategy is so vital. I will also say there's something that is bubbling below the surface in philanthropy that is so very powerful around funding movements, but also understanding how they might be complicit in inequality. So, being able to to use the language, right, to be able to access resources, I think is what movements need and have always needed, right? That's why nonprofits and different parts of the systems have been kind of seen as the creator of movements. The sustaining of movements in these days and times, I believe, is very possible by working directly with philanthropies. There is more alignment around values in this country than there ever has been, but the resources are what is needed to sustain pressure and to bring in more expertise, more experience, more of the solutions. And that's what I think people often don't understand, because there are outreach and engagement mandates to a lot of federal dollars that was kind of perfunctory. But when we think about community involvement, involving the people who are most disparately impacted in creating solutions, being the recipients of targeted resources, and driving change at the local level, it's a very different way of thinking about what is possible. And so part of what the Just Communities work does, we will be working very specifically with communities who are already leading. And our goal and our mandate is not to actually bring them to the table, it's to help them to have decision-making power and to continue to build the power with communities. So I think it's thinking differently. We're not saviors. The movement's been underway for centuries, to your point. How do we really think about it and get comfortable with ceding power? Back to my earlier comment, we should not be afraid of an inclusive society. It really will be better for everyone. And as a mixed-race, multiracial person, we are already here, and we cannot legislate how communities blend, who people love, who we identify with. But one thing that we can change is the economic circumstance of generation after generation. So that, I think, is more of the focus. If we look at the economic status of people, no matter what percentage they are of this or that, we do see patterns of inequality. And that's, Carlton's point, I love your 3 questions. Those are exactly the ways that we need to think about how do we push for disproportionate allocation of resources.
I see his hand, Carlton. I see one more person. How about I call them 30-second answers? If I get some 30-second replies, we'll squeeze them in.
Real quick,
Carlton, on your fourth question, you need a fourth question. You need to talk about good intentional benefits as well, not just the deficit. But the gentleman, I mean, I would say this real quick: the inside-out strategy. Like some of us here are the first in the door in the federal government. It's been my case every position that I've taken that have my background. So the inside-out strategy is this. And everybody who works with me understands this. Nothing I do in government is in a unilateral way. It's always flanking a community movement or decision or goal. And when you do that, you know at least for me, I know I'm in a good place to sort of be moving in that direction. You get into trouble when you're not in those lanes. And so there's a lot more to say about inside-out strategy.
And what I'm gonna do is invite you all to exit at that door, and then any additional questions there might be. But let me squeeze in this young woman. She's been patiently standing for her short question. And your short
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ivanka Hall. I am the Executive Director of the Northeast Ohio Black Health Coalition. My question is around, you talk about sustainability and equity, but we know that a lot of our organizations have been infiltrated by people who claim sustainability and equity, but when you look at some of the things that they're doing, it has nothing to do with changing the conditions of the community, but they're in charge. And so we have a big problem when we have all of these people who claim that they side with our communities, but the things that they're doing have nothing to do with our communities. We have a picture that we show all the time around equity with the boxes, and so you have the black people looking over the fence, and so they change the box, but then the white people are sitting in the audience. True equity would take them away from the fence and put them into the audience. And so when we look at that, we don't understand that that is not equity, that they need to be where everybody else is, not standing at the fence waiting for the box that fits them so that they can look over.
And with that, I think we're going to conclude the plenary. Again, we want to thank you all for